Hi, I'm John Baboian from Berklee College of Music in Boston. You're watching For Guitar Players Only.
Hi everyone, John Liebman here. You're watching ForGuitarPlayersOnly.com. Coming to you today on location from Boston, Massachusetts, on the campus of Berklee College of Music with our good friend and faculty member, John Baboian. Hi, John.
Hi, John. Thank you for coming and spending some time.
Well, thank you for your hospitality. We always have a great time and a great experience here at Berklee. You've been on the faculty here for got to be getting close to 40 years already.
Yeah, it's getting there. I always started when I was a baby, so 37 years later, I'm still here.
Yes.
They're waiting for me to do it right so they can send me off.
Do you know, one of the things that has always impressed me about Berklee, I interviewed a bunch of the bass faculty for one of my other sites called ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I interviewed several people from the guitar faculty, and there are a lot of faculty members and professors here at Berklee who have been here 10, 20, 30, 40 years, some of them. So that has got to say a lot about this school and this environment and
It's
place
a
to
wonderful place to be. And I was a student here back in the 70s when I was young. And at the time...
Oh, you're still young, John.
I'm still young. At the time, there really was no place else to go to study contemporary guitar. And so at 1972, 73, I'm looking around at schools, and I could either study classical guitar or I could come to Berklee. Now, my good fortune, Berklee was in my backyard, 5 miles away. But if Berklee had been in Australia, I would have gone to Australia because this was it. This was the only place that I could really study what I wanted to study. And to a certain extent, it's still that way now. Yes, different schools have kind of drawn on what we do, and they have expanded their horizons around the world. But Berklee is still, I think, the epicenter of what contemporary guitar education is about.
Well, and they obviously taught you well because you've done some pretty fascinating things. And the cross-section of the people with whom you've played, everybody from Connie Francis and Jim Neighbors and Frankie Avalon to Gary Burton and Joe Lovano, and everybody in between. Tell me a little bit about your musical upbringing and what were your musical surroundings like when you were growing up and how you became a guitar player.
Oh, good question. When my father, who just recently passed away 2 months ago, was a brass player. Not professional, amateur. He was an optometrist who also played brass. So there were brass instruments all around my house. And so when I turned 8 in 4th grade and everybody was taking an instrument, it was just automatic. Here's a trumpet. Play this, which I did. I wasn't a very good trumpet player. So it didn't take long around the late 1960s during that guitar period for me to say to Dad, hey, Dad, I really want to play guitar. So we made a little deal. Dad, you get me a guitar and I'll keep playing the trumpet. We discovered very quickly that guitar was my instrument, not the trumpet.
When was the last time you picked up a trumpet?
I still play brass. Not great, but I play. But clearly, when you pick up an instrument and you discover physically that you're getting around it pretty well and that you're making musical statements on an instrument, you know that's your voice, yes, so to speak. And although I really enjoy playing brass as well, because it's different to blow into an instrument than it is to pluck and fret an instrument, they're two different feelings that you get. And the guitar is my voice.
Yeah. Well, it seems to have worked out for you.
Can't complain. It's been a nice career so far.
Yes. Well, over the course of, I think you said 37 years or so that you've been here, you must have seen all kinds of different students. And I was in the education business, the school business. One of the first things I learned was, as an educator, every year we get a year older. But the students stay the same age.
I noticed that. Well, we start joking about that and saying, you notice those students are getting younger and younger as we go? And, of course, it's the opposite that's happening. But I enjoy interacting with them and teaching them because it helps me stay young as well. It helps me keep focused on what's happening in music so that I'm not just becoming a dinosaur. Although, as a jazzer, there is a tendency for us to be a little bit dinosaur-like anyway because of the music that we play, old standards, because of the harmony, because of the melody, the melodic content and all that's in old standards. But hearing what a young person is listening to and trying to play helps you to stay on top of what's going on, and you're hearing the progression of the music because music is not going to stop. It will keep progressing, which is why we call chords a progression. And even if you look back into history, the progression of the music from Bach to Beethoven, from Beethoven to Debussy, from Debussy to Stravinsky, from Stravinsky to Ellington, from Ellington and Gershwin to Charlie Parker, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It grows to John Scofield today. And it's just, you can see and hear the lineage of all of that. And it's part of what we do. And of course, 10 years from now, it's going to be somebody else. And we're going to have to know who that is and what they're doing.
Somebody that you're teaching or have taught.
That would be nice, yeah.
Well, what I'm getting at, though, do the students today have pretty similar aspirations as the students back when you first started teaching? Do they all, I guess they probably don't all want to be rock stars, but I imagine you see your share of those people. But you have some very definite ideas that you want to impart to your students, and I know that there's a certain approach about rock and about jazz and being able to do everything that you're called upon to do. Can you share some of your education philosophy that is important to you that you impart to your students?
Yeah, I always try and tell my students that, if you emulate to be so-and-so who's on the main stage, John Mayer, for example, that's such a small percentage of musicians that are out there that to get to that point, first off, you have to be very good, of course. Second, you have to be very lucky, right place at the right time, know some people, look the right way, and that's how you become one of those people. But the chances of that happening are almost like hitting the lottery. So you have to prepare yourself not to be in that position necessarily, but to be able to be in that position as the backing musician who makes the star sound good, who can go to the gig and do anything that's called for by that gig and have the versatility in your playing to be able to cover a lot of bases. And at the end, you take the check, you're getting paid for what you do, you're successful at what you're doing. You might not be the star, you might not be the person that everybody's paying specific attention to, but you're a major part of what's making that musical element happen at that time. And that goes whether you're playing as a rocker, a pop musician, a jazz musician. It's all the same way that as the accompanying musician, you're a valuable tool to the gang.
Well, I'm a bass player, so that concept comes very naturally to me. But with the guitar players, is that something that you find a lot of resistance from the students? Do they fight you on that? Or I'm sure a handful of them get it, and probably a smaller handful, no, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm different. I'm going to be a star. What do you find as far as that goes?
You know what? I think they're all open to the suggestion, because they're all smart enough to understand that, yes, they're not all going to be a superstar. But as I did when I was young, my goal was to be that star. I wanted to be Jimi Hendrix. I wanted to be Carlos Santana. I wanted to be George Benson. At some point I realized, well, there's a likelihood that that's not quite going to happen. And so I try and give my students that same idea that you need to strive to try and be who you want to be. Because, yeah, you might make it. And if you do, wonderful. I'm going to be the first one in the front row clapping for you. But if that doesn't happen, you've got to figure out a way to make a living doing this, because this is still a business. This is still a job. You still have to pay rent. You still have to put food on the table. And that's just the realities of life.
How about you outside your domain here at Berkeley and your career? You manage to still keep pretty busy? You get to play out once in a while and keep your hand in it?
Yeah, I do. I play about 10, 15 gigs a month pretty regularly. A lot of times I'm accompanying singers. I like to joke that as long as the singers are still working, I'm going to be okay. Because they need accompanists, and that's what I do. In fact, one of the courses that I teach at the school here is guitar approaches to vocal accompaniment technique. So essentially learning how to work with singers. And that's a very specific idea. Yeah, you have to have knowledge of your instrument, you have to be able to play bass lines, you have to be able to play chords, and you have to be able to improvise, but you also have to be able to navigate the world of how you deal with a singer. Key changes, personalities, And there's a lot else involved with this, but it's a part of what I do as a performing musician, is accompanying others. And
You just conjured up an image in my head of Joe Pass and Ella Fitzgerald.
Absolutely.
That's the first place my mind went when you said that.
That's two of the people that I use as my guide in that class, because that was the epitome of one of the greatest singers in history and one of the greatest guitar players in history coming together as a duo and doing exactly that. How do you accompany a singer, make them feel comfortable, make them feel good, and you do your job and you do your performance well as well. And they were the epitome of that.
How about your equipment and your gear and your strings and all that stuff?
A lot of stuff, because there's a lot of guitars. I don't think I have ever gotten rid of any guitar that I have purchased. And that's a guitar player's ailment. But it's kind of a fun ailment. You know?
The old joke, the guy gets a new guitar, so his wife says, so you're going to get rid of the last one, right? And it's a good laugh that everybody shares.
Because I've got them all. They're all in my... primarily, my main guitar right now is this Martin Archtop. And when people see me playing, they kind of like look at that and say, Martin Archtop? What is that? Well, between around 2005 to 2010, Martin decided they wanted to get into the jazz scene, and they made two Archtop guitars, a CF1 and a CF2. One was a thicker one was a little thinner, this one. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time. Again, luck and good fortune, when they needed someone to be a clinician for the new guitars. So for about 5 years, I was doing clinics for the guitars. Now, unfortunately, what happened was they probably couldn't sell enough of these because people equate Martin with flat top guitars. And so as a result of that, and also a lot of less expensive guitars coming from China and Korea, they decided, we'll ditch that and we'll go back to the flat tops only and do what we do best, which they do. In the meantime,
So it's a rarity, it's a collector's item, and it's probably very valuable.
But it's a nice instrument, so I enjoy playing it.
I see the name D'Addario a lot in association with you. You've been a long-time D'Addario user?
I have played D'Addario strings since the mid-'70s. It's very weird. I don't know.
Not the same set.
Not the same set. No, I change them every once in a while. But as a student, I remember getting the half-round strings that D'Addario made at that time, because I was coming from a rock background. I was using round-wound strings, turning into a jazzer like I did, because I went from Hendrix and Santana to Joe Pass and Wes Montgomery. So I went from round-wound strings ultimately to flat-wound strings. That crossover happened with what D'Addario used to make, and I don't know if they still make them, half-rounds. And they were polished round-wound strings, which had more of the flat-wound, darker, warmer sound, but still had enough of the brightness of the round-wound. At some point, I made the full transition to D'Addario flat-wounds, because flat-wounds, like if you listen, put the mic down here. There's nothing, which is great. I had a situation where I was playing a solo guitar brunch gig at a restaurant locally. This was about 10 years ago or so. And after about an hour of playing or so, an elderly gentleman who had been sitting listening, and I noticed he had been listening. He comes walking over to the stage slowly with his cane, and he comes up to me and he says, "You know how I can tell you're a good guitar player?" I said, "No, what?" He says, "I don't hear any of those scratchy sounds coming from your guitar." I said, "Oh, thank you." I didn't want to tell him it's the flat-wound strings, but that proved something to me, that people who are listening hear that.
That's interesting.
And even you might not even be aware of that little scratchiness that comes from round-wound strings, and they're there inherently. You know, the better you are at lifting your fingers off quicker, you can get less of it, but it's always going to be there to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Flat ones get rid of that. So that's one of the reasons why I keep with my flat ones. I also enjoy the warmer sound of it, and D'Addario makes them very well.
How about amps?
I've also got all of the amps that I've ever bought. I started out with an old Fender Showman, which is the size of a small refrigerator. It's still in my basement. It doesn't fit in my car anymore, so it sits in the basement, but it's still there. I graduated to polytones because of the jazz need. When my polytone broke after a while, I went to a Roland Cube because it was small, light, compact, and it was at the first ones that they put out, it was orange.
Okay.
But it was a nice 60 watt.
So orange doesn't have a patent on the color orange?
This was an orange Roland Cube amp. So yes, orange amps didn't patent the color.
Okay.
When that went out of its way, I went to a PV Special 130. A friend of mine had one, and it was heavy. It was compact, but it was heavy because it had a really nice speaker in it. And I played through it, and I said, you know what? This sounds like a polytone, except louder. So as a jazz guitar amp, it really worked nicely because it gave me the power and strength when I needed it. So if I'm going to a rock gig, I could use it. And when I went to my jazz gigs, I could use it. Same guitar, same amp.
Same guitar for a rock gig and a jazz gig?
I can get this. This has 2 pickups on it, and I can crank it and get some nice rockabilly sounds out of the front pickup there, the bridge pickup.
I wasn't expecting that. Good for you.
But I've got my 335 and other instruments as well that I used if I'm going to rock out a little bit. And then at some point, I still have my PVs. I've got 2 of them, Special 130s. I was in South Africa, and I was doing some teaching clinics and playing in Cape Town, South Africa. And the person who was giving me the amp to use at that point had a small Roland acoustic AC60 amp. And I said, oh, that's really small. I don't know what kind of sound I'm going to get out of this. I plugged it in, and it had this beautiful archtop sound. I think because of the acoustic properties that they build into the amp and the tweeter that's in there, it just has a little bit more depth than a standard magnetic pickup amp. And so I bought this AC60. When I needed it more power for it to play with drummers, I bought an AC90, which is a little bit bigger. Yeah. And so depending on the gig, it's either the Roland AC amps or my PV Special 130s.
Interesting how you had to go all the way to South Africa to discover that amp. But what about the future? What else would you like to do that you haven't already accomplished music-wise?
Writing more music, I hope. That's one of the things you always try and do.
Well, that's right. You've written for, was it All My Children and The Sopranos, I think? And
a number of years ago, I was working with a producer who was teaching here a bit and doing a lot of production work with TV and film. And so she was getting music to be used in TV and film. And at one point, the funny story about this was she called me on the phone, and this was the time when The Sopranos was big on HBO. She called and said, do you watch The Sopranos? And I said, yes, it's my favorite show. Every Sunday night, I'm glued to the television for that. And she says, well, you're going to be on next week. I said, huh? They took one of your songs and they're putting it in the background of this scene where Tony and the boys are in the restaurant talking about who they're going to whack next. And in the background is going to be your song, Bossa Baboian. I said, great, fine.
So whatever emotion you were going for when you wrote that music, how close was what it ended up being used for to what you had in mind when you wrote it?
Well, at that particular scene, it was meant to be restaurant background music. Okay. It was solo guitar on a nylon string guitar. It was a bossa, so it was pretty background music. But it's there, and then that song and others that I've used have been used on a lot of soap operas, and so it's a matter of again, right place at the right time. There's so much luck involved with this. Another story that goes with this: the Musicians Union in Boston called me about 5 years ago and said there's going to be a movie filming in Boston. They need a band. We're putting together some of the people we know in the Boston area, and are you available to play guitar for this? I said, sure, not knowing what it was about. But then I had a wedding that I was supposed to do in Washington, D.C. that weekend that they were filming. And I said, well, if I go to the 2 nights of the filming, I can still get on a plane and get to Washington, D.C. The film turned out to be Ted. Ted 1. And ended up
nutty film.
Crazy. And in the middle of the film, there's a scene in the house party where the band, the camera shows on us and comes right to me and stays for a bit. And so my 2.5 seconds of fame. But everybody at the school saw the film, and they were stopping me on the street. Oh, wow. And people who didn't know me were stopping me. And I'm saying, this is really wild. And so my little claim to fame is the middle scene in Ted.
I knew you looked familiar,
That's
John.
it. You look for the mustachio and the guitar player, and that's it.
Last question, John. What would you be if you were not a guitar player? And something outside of music.
The easy answer is a public school teacher teaching music.
Okay.
Outside of music, my father was an optometrist. I was an apprentice optician for him when I was very young. I probably would have continued with that, I suppose. I used to sit working on his lab work with his eyeglasses and the frames and all, and I'd have my guitar. I'd put a lens in the machine and wait for the timer to go, and while I was doing that, I'm practicing my scales. The next lens in and out. Okay, practice some more scales.
You have to be careful. You might make a spectacle of yourself.
Oh, very good.
Okay. On that, no, sorry, folks, but no, you know what? I'm not sorry. Great to see you in person, and after everything I've seen and heard and read about you, and most importantly, heard your playing. So it's a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to sit down with you one-on-one like this. Much luck, continued success to you, and keep us posted on everything else.
If they want to check out my website, it's www.johnbaboian.com. JohnBaboian.com.
Got it.
Yeah.
With our good friend John Baboian on the campus of Berkeley College of Music in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm John Liebman. You're watching for GuitarPlayersOnly.com.